The dining room was silent, except for the soft clinking of silverware on fine china. Matteo Delacroix sat rigidly at the grand table, his plate untouched. The room was adorned with an air of opulence. A crystal chandelier cast a warm glow over the polished mahogany surface, and priceless artwork lined the walls. But none of it could distract Matteo from the weight of the words that had just been spoken. "I've made arrangements for your future," Cameron Delacroix announced, his voice firm and calculated. His piercing gaze locked onto Matteo's. "Margaret Davenport is the ideal match for you. She's intelligent, well-connected, and her family's wealth will secure our position in the tech sector for decades." Matteo's chest tightened, and he forced a bitter smile. "You mean her family's oil fortune will secure your empire, don't you?" His tone was calm, but carried the sting of defiance. Vivienne Delacroix, seated to Cameron's right, offered a strained smile. "Matteo, darling, this is what's best for you. Margaret is a sophisticated woman. She understands our world." "She's 18 years older than me," Matteo interrupted, his voice rising. He pushed his chair back and stood, looming over the table. "This isn't a marriage. It's a transaction." Cameron's expression hardened. "And you're the collateral. This family didn't rise to where it is today by indulging in childish whims. You've had your freedom long enough. Now it's time to grow up and fulfill your responsibilities." Matteo's fists clenched at his sides. "Responsibilities? You mean sacrificing my life so you can play puppet master?" "Number, I won't do it." The air grew thick with tension. Cameron leaned forward, his voice low and steely. "Then you can leave. Walk out that door, Matteo, and you'll have nothing. No family, no legacy, no future." Matteo's breath caught. He glanced at Vivienne, hoping for some sign of support, but her eyes avoided his. It was clear where her loyalties lay. His heart pounded as the ultimatum echoed in his head. Obey or be discarded. Without another word, Matteo turned on his heel and strode out of the room. Behind him, he heard the faint sound of Vivienne calling his name, but he didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Not this time. An hour later, Matteo stood in the driveway of the Delacroix estate, his car idling behind him. He stared back at the sprawling mansion he had called home, its pristine facade glowing under the moonlight. How many times had he felt like a prisoner within those walls? How many times had he swallowed his pride, pretending he could one day shape his own destiny? The realization hit him like a cold wave. He had nothing to lose anymore. Cameron had made sure of that. Sliding into the driver's seat, Matteo gripped the wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white. With a deep breath, he pulled onto the long, winding driveway and didn't look back. The engine's hum was the only sound accompanying him as he sped down the dark highway, leaving the trappings of his old life behind. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of freedom, though it came with a gnawing uncertainty about what lay ahead. Matteo drove through the night, the city lights of New York fading into a blur behind him. The further he went, the lighter he felt, as if every mile between him and the Delacroix estate peeled away another layer of expectation. Yet the weight of his father's ultimatum lingered in his chest, each breath a reminder of the gamble he was taking. The highway stretched endlessly, illuminated only by the glow of Matteo's headlights. He replayed the argument in his mind, Cameron's voice echoing with disdain. No family, no legacy, no future. Matteo had grown used to his father's controlling demeanor, but this time something had snapped. For years he had accepted the gilded cage, until now. His thoughts drifted to Vivienne, the only source of softness in his otherwise rigid upbringing. She had called his name as he left, but not with enough conviction to make him stay. Matteo knew she loved him, but her loyalty to Cameron always came first. The open road offered a strange comfort as Matteo headed south. Childhood memories flickered in his mind. Humid summers, jazz music spilling into the streets, and the vibrant chaos of New Orleans. He hadn't been back in years, but something about the city called to him now. It was far enough to escape Cameron's reach, yet familiar enough to give him a sense of direction. As dawn broke, Matteo pulled into a rest stop on the outskirts of a small town. The night's adrenaline had worn off, replaced by exhaustion. He leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his dark hair. He didn't have a plan, only the vague hope that New Orleans could offer him a fresh start. Reaching into the back seat, Matteo grabbed a duffel bag he had packed in haste. Inside were a few essentials: clothes, a laptop, and the last bit of cash he had withdrawn before Cameron froze his accounts. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. After stretching his legs and grabbing a weak cup of coffee from a vending machine, Matteo got back on the road. The rising sun painted the horizon in shades of orange and pink, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside him. As he drove, he rehearsed the lies he would need to tell about his past, his name, and why he had come to New Orleans. The fewer people who knew the truth, the better. By the time he reached the city, the streets were alive with energy. Jazz music drifted through open windows, and the smell of fresh beignets wafted from a corner cafe. Matteo rolled down his window, letting the humid air fill the car. Despite the tension in his chest, a small smile tugged at his lips. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Parking in the French Quarter, Matteo stepped out of the car and slung his duffel bag over his shoulder. The architecture around him was a mix of old-world charm and vibrant color, with wrought-iron balconies draped in green vines. The city felt alive, a stark contrast to the sterile halls of the Delacroix estate. As Matteo wandered the streets, he spotted a small cafe with a sign that read, "Helena's Haven." The name intrigued him, and he felt an inexplicable pull toward the cozy, inviting space. A bell jingled softly as he pushed open the door, and the aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread enveloped him. Behind the counter stood a young woman with dark hair loosely tied back, her warm eyes scanning the room as she handed a cup to a customer. Matteo hesitated, feeling an unfamiliar sense of ease in her presence. "Good morning," she greeted, her voice carrying a friendly lilt. "What can I get for you?" Matteo stepped forward, his rehearsed lies ready. "Just a coffee," he said, offering a faint smile. As Helena prepared his order, Matteo couldn't help but notice the ease with which she moved, her demeanor a stark contrast to the calculated interactions he had grown up with. For the first time in what felt like years, he wasn't Matteo Delacroix, heir to a tech empire. He was just a man trying to find his way. The cafe was small but inviting, with its mismatched wooden tables and chairs arranged haphazardly under the warm glow of hanging string lights. Matteo found a seat near the window, letting the hum of conversation and the soft clinking of ceramic mugs ease his nerves. From this vantage point, he could observe the room without drawing attention to himself. He needed to stay under the radar, at least until he figured out his next move. Helena moved efficiently behind the counter, her hands deftly pouring steaming coffee into a cup, while greeting another customer by name. There was a natural grace to her movements, as if this cafe was an extension of herself. Matteo found himself watching her longer than he intended, drawn to the warmth she seemed to radiate. "Here you go." Helena appeared beside him, placing a cup of coffee on the table with a practiced smile. "It's on the house. You look like you've had a rough morning." Caught off guard, Matteo hesitated before responding. "That obvious, huh?" He managed a wry grin, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. She tilted her head, studying him with curiosity. "New in town?" "Just passing through," Matteo replied quickly, a little too quickly. He took a sip of the coffee to avoid further explanation, surprised by its rich, earthy flavor. It was better than anything he'd had back in New York. "Well, welcome to Helena's Haven," she said, gesturing toward the space around her. "If you're looking for some peace and quiet, this is probably the best spot in the quarter." Matteo nodded, his grip tightening slightly on the mug. "Thanks, it's nice here." Helena smiled at his awkwardness before returning to the counter. Matteo exhaled slowly, grateful she didn't press for more. His carefully constructed lies felt fragile under her kind gaze. As the cafe began to fill with the morning crowd, Matteo observed the interactions around him. Customers greeted Helena with familiarity, exchanging snippets of small talk about their lives. There was a sense of community here, something Matteo had never experienced in his world of high-rises and corporate boardrooms. A sharp, teenage voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, who are you?" Matteo turned to see a boy, maybe 16 or 17, standing a few feet away with his arms crossed. He had the same dark hair as Helena, but his expression was sharper, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "I'm Matteo," he said carefully, offering a polite smile. "Just passing through." The boy didn't look convinced. "Right." His tone dripped with doubt. "I'm Noah. That's my sister over there." "Helena mentioned you." Matteo nodded toward the counter, hoping to diffuse the tension. "She said you help out here." "Yeah, when I'm not busy," Noah replied, still sizing him up. "You don't look like you're from around here." Matteo chuckled lightly, trying to play it cool. "I'm not. Just needed a change of scenery." Noah raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, retreating to the back of the cafe. Matteo could feel the boy's lingering mistrust, though he couldn't blame him. After all, he was a stranger in their world. Matteo turned his attention back to the cafe, trying to shake the uneasy feeling Noah's scrutiny left behind. He reminded himself that this was the kind of suspicion he would have to get used to if he wanted to keep his past hidden. People were bound to ask questions, especially in a tight-knit community like this one. The morning rush began to settle, leaving the cafe quieter and more relaxed. Helena reappeared at Matteo's table, carrying a cloth to wipe down the surface next to his. "So," she said, her tone light, "have you decided how long you'll be passing through?" Matteo hesitated, unsure of what to say. He couldn't exactly tell her the truth, that he was running from a controlling father and a life he wanted no part of. "Not sure yet," he replied vaguely. "I guess it depends on how things go." Helena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "New Orleans has a way of pulling people in. Sometimes you come for a visit and end up staying a lifetime." "Is that what happened to you?" Matteo asked, genuinely curious. She chuckled softly, leaning on the chair opposite him. "Sort of. I was born here, but I left for a while, college and all that. Then, after my parents passed, I came back to take care of Noah and this place." She gestured toward the cafe, her smile softening. "It's a lot of work, but it's home." Matteo couldn't help but admire her resolve. Helena carried herself with a quiet strength, the kind of resilience born from hardship. "You've built something special here," he said sincerely. "Thanks," she replied, her eyes meeting his. "It's not easy, but I have Noah to keep me going. And the people here, they're like family." The word family hung in the air, tugging at something inside Matteo. He hadn't felt a true sense of family in years, not since his father's ambition began to consume every aspect of their lives. Here, in this small cafe with mismatched furniture and the smell of fresh bread, the word seemed to mean something different, something real. Before he could dwell on it, the door jingled as a tall woman with fiery red hair stepped inside, drawing Helena's attention. "Isabel!" Helena called, her face lighting up. "Right on time." Matteo watched as Isabel Dupree, dressed in a flowing bohemian dress and carrying a saxophone case, strode toward the counter with a confident air. She greeted Helena with a warm hug before glancing in Matteo's direction. "And who's this?" Isabel asked, her voice smooth and teasing. "A new face," Helena said, glancing at Matteo with a small smile. "Matteo, meet Isabel. She's a jazz musician, and one of the best in the quarter." Isabel raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. "Well, Matteo, I hope you like music. Around here you don't really have a choice." Matteo chuckled, sensing the playful energy Isabel brought into the room. "I'll try to keep up." "Good," she said, setting her case down, "because if you're sticking around, you're going to hear a lot of it." As Helena and Isabel began chatting, Matteo felt a strange sense of ease washing over him. For the first time in days, he wasn't just running. He was beginning to feel like he'd found a place where he could breathe. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't last unless he could figure out how to truly let go of the life he'd left behind, and the lies he still carried. New Orleans was giving him a second chance, but the question lingered. How long could he keep his past from catching up with him? The connections forged in this chapter, especially with Helena and Isabel, lay the foundation for Matteo's integration into the community, while Noah's suspicion foreshadows future tension. These elements will develop further in Chapter 3 as Matteo begins to find his place in Helena's world. The days in New Orleans began to take on a rhythm that Matteo found oddly comforting. Each morning, he'd arrive at Helena's cafe, securing his usual spot by the window. The air carried the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods, mingling with the soft hum of jazz spilling in from the streets. He wasn't sure what kept him coming back: the coffee, the sense of anonymity, or Helena herself. Whatever it was, he felt grounded here in a way he hadn't in years. The cafe was busier than usual today, and Matteo found himself watching Helena as she moved from table to table, balancing trays and exchanging warm smiles with customers. She seemed to know everyone by name, asking about their families or their latest endeavors. The connection she shared with the people around her was something Matteo both admired and envied. It reminded him of what he'd always craved but never had: belonging. "You're still here?" Noah's voice broke into Matteo's thoughts. The teenager stood at the counter, wiping down glasses with a rag. His tone was casual, but there was a sharp edge to it, as though he were still trying to figure Matteo out. Matteo turned to him, offering a small smile. "Looks like it." Noah didn't return the smile. Instead, he leaned on the counter, his gaze steady. "So what's your deal? You're not a tourist. You don't have the locals vibe either, and you spend a lot of time watching people." Matteo hesitated. Noah wasn't wrong, and the boy's directness left little room for maneuvering. "I'm just looking for a little peace and quiet," Matteo said finally. "That's all." Noah's eyes narrowed, as if weighing the truth of that statement. Before he could respond, Helena appeared behind him, lightly swatting him on the shoulder with a dish towel. "Stop interrogating the customers, Noah." "I'm just saying," Noah replied with a shrug, though he didn't take his eyes off Matteo. "Go finish stacking the dishes," Helena said firmly, steering her brother away. She turned to Matteo with an apologetic smile. "Sorry about him. He gets a little protective sometimes." "It's fine," Matteo said, his tone easy. "He's just looking out for you." Helena gave a small laugh, her shoulders relaxing. "That he is. He thinks he has to keep the whole world at arm's length." "And you?" Matteo asked, meeting her gaze. "What keeps you going?" Helena hesitated, the question catching her off guard. Her fingers played absently with the edge of her apron. "This place," she said finally, gesturing to the cafe around her. "It's not just a business. It's home. For me, for Noah, for the people who come here. It's a little chaotic, but it's ours." Her words lingered in the air, and Matteo found himself nodding. He didn't press further, sensing she had already shared more than she intended. It was becoming increasingly clear that Helena's strength came not just from survival, but from creating something meaningful in the wake of loss. As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting golden hues across the cafe, Matteo leaned back in his chair, observing the ebb and flow of activity. The room was quieter now, with only a handful of customers lingering over their drinks. Helena stood behind the counter, organizing the register, while Noah busied himself stacking clean plates on a nearby shelf. Matteo was just beginning to enjoy the calm when Isabel breezed through the door, her presence immediately lighting up the room. She carried a large tote bag slung over her shoulder, its contents clinking faintly as she set it down by the counter. "Helena, darling, I've brought the essentials," she declared, pulling out a bottle of wine and a loaf of crusty bread. Helena looked up, her face breaking into a grin. "Isabel, it's the middle of the day." "And your point?" Isabel replied, raising an eyebrow. "A little wine never hurt anyone. Besides, I thought you could use a break." Helena rolled her eyes, but couldn't suppress her smile. Matteo watched the exchange, amused by their easy rapport. Isabel seemed to bring a certain spark to every room she entered, her energy infectious and unapologetic. "Matteo," Isabel called out, spotting him by the window, "don't think you're getting away without joining us." He hesitated, then stood, walking over to the counter. "I wouldn't dare," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Isabel clapped her hands together. "Good man. Now let's have a toast. To friends, to fresh starts, and to whatever else this crazy city decides to throw at us." Helena fetched 3 mismatched glasses from the shelf, and Noah reluctantly joined them, his arms crossed as he leaned against the counter. Isabel poured the wine generously, her movements animated as she spoke. "You know, Matteo, I've got a feeling about you. New Orleans has a way of attracting the lost souls, the ones looking for something they can't quite name." Matteo raised an eyebrow, unsure how to respond. "Is that what brought you here?" "Absolutely," Isabel said without hesitation. "I came for the music, but I stayed because this place makes you feel alive. You'll see, it gets under your skin." Helena chuckled softly, raising her glass. "To New Orleans?" "To New Orleans," Matteo echoed, his voice quieter. He clinked glasses with the others, the moment feeling strangely intimate. For a brief second, he allowed himself to believe that this sense of belonging could last. As the small group settled into easy conversation, Matteo felt the edges of his tension begin to ease. Isabel regaled them with stories of her late-night gigs at local jazz clubs, her voice rising and falling like the melody of a song. Helena listened with quiet amusement, while Noah pretended not to care, though Matteo caught the faintest hint of a smile on the boy's face. When the conversation turned to Matteo, he carefully navigated their questions, sticking to the vague narrative he'd rehearsed. "I needed a change," he explained simply. "Sometimes you just have to start fresh." Isabel nodded knowingly, her sharp eyes studying him. "Well, if you're staying, you'll fit right in. Just remember, New Orleans is all about giving as much as you take. You don't just live here, you become part of it." Her words stayed with Matteo long after the conversation shifted. As the afternoon faded into evening, he found himself wondering what it would mean to truly belong, not just in New Orleans, but anywhere. For now, though, he resolved to take it one day at a time. This place had given him a reprieve, a chance to breathe. What came next would depend on his ability to hold on to it, and the people who were unknowingly pulling him closer to something real. The cafe was unusually quiet that morning, the hum of conversation replaced by the soft clinking of cups as Helena prepared a tray for one of her regulars. Matteo sat at his usual spot near the window, staring absently at the rising steam from his coffee. His thoughts were heavy, circling back to the last phone call he had ignored, a call from Vivian. The buzz of his phone in his pocket snapped him out of his reverie. Pulling it out, he saw the name flashing on the screen. Mom. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail as he had the previous calls, but something compelled him to answer this time. Matteo. Vivian's voice was soft, almost pleading. Please don't hang up. He didn't respond immediately, his grip tightening on the phone. What do you want, Mum? Vivian sighed, her hesitation palpable through the line. We need to talk. Your father is furious. He's freezing your accounts, Matteo. I tried to stop him, but you know how he is. Matteo leaned back in his chair, his jaw tightening. Let him. I don't care. You say that now, but you're running out of options, Vivian continued. I'm not calling to guilt you. I want you to come home. We can figure this out together. Figure what out? How to marry me off to Margaret Davenport to save Dad's empire? Matteo's voice was sharp, the bitterness unmistakable. It's not like that, Vivian replied, though the strain in her voice betrayed her. You know how much your father values legacy. He's trying to secure your future. My future? Matteo let out a bitter laugh. My future doesn't exist under his thumb. I've made my decision, Mum. I'm not coming back. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Matteo thought she might hang up. Instead, her voice dropped, quieter, almost desperate. Be careful, Matteo. Your father, he won't just let you go. The line went dead, leaving Matteo staring at his phone with a mix of anger and unease. Vivian's warning lingered in his mind. He knew Cameron would go to great lengths to control him, but he hadn't expected this level of escalation. Freezing his accounts was only the beginning. He slipped his phone back into his pocket and exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the bustling street outside. For the first time since arriving in New Orleans, he felt the weight of his old life pressing down on him again. Bad news? Helena's voice startled him. She was standing beside his table, her expression tinged with concern. Just family stuff, Matteo said vaguely, forcing a small smile. Nothing I can't handle? Helena studied him for a moment, as if deciding whether to push further. Finally, she nodded, her voice soft. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around. Matteo's smile softened, gratitude flickering in his eyes. Thanks, Helena. I'll keep that in mind. Matteo tried to shake off the tension as the morning wore on, but Vivian's words continued to echo in his mind. By mid-afternoon, he found himself outside the cafe, leaning against the building and staring at the bustling street. He didn't have a plan, and that realization was starting to gnaw at him. The freedom he had sought in New Orleans felt fragile now, threatened by the invisible hand of his father. The door behind him opened, and Isabel stepped out, her tote bag slung over her shoulder. She glanced at Matteo, her sharp eyes catching his somber expression immediately. Trouble in paradise? She teased lightly, though her tone carried a hint of concern. Matteo managed a faint smirk. Something like that. Isabel leaned against the wall beside him, pulling a cigarette from her bag. You know, I've seen that look before. The one where someone's running from something but hasn't figured out how far they're willing to go. He didn't respond right away, watching as she lit the cigarette and exhaled a cloud of smoke. You're not wrong, he admitted finally. But running only gets you so far, doesn't it? Depends, Isabel said, shrugging. Sometimes running gives you just enough distance to figure out what you're running toward. Matteo let her words sink in, the weight of them settling over him like the humid New Orleans air. Before he could reply, his phone buzzed again in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw an email notification. The subject line made his stomach drop. Immediate action required. Account freezes. He clenched his jaw, muttering under his breath. Isabel glanced over, curiosity flickering in her eyes. That bad? Just another reminder that my family doesn't know how to let go, Matteo said bitterly, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Isabel raised an eyebrow. Family drama, huh? Let me guess. Money, power, control? All of the above, Matteo replied, his tone dry. He hesitated, then added, My father isn't exactly the type to take no for an answer. Isabel took another drag of her cigarette, nodding thoughtfully. Well, if you're looking to disappear, New Orleans isn't a bad place for it. People here don't ask too many questions, as long as you pull your weight. Matteo glanced at her, something in her words sparking an idea. Pull your weight, huh? She smirked. Exactly. You want to blend in? Find a way to make yourself useful. People around here respect effort, not excuses. Matteo nodded slowly, her advice resonating. If he wanted to stay in New Orleans, he needed more than anonymity. He needed roots. A reason to stay. I'll think about that, he said, offering her a small, genuine smile. Thanks, Isabel. She waved a hand dismissively, her lips quirking into a grin. Don't mention it. Just don't let whatever you're running from catch up to you, okay? As she disappeared down the street, Matteo felt a flicker of resolve. He didn't know what his next move would be, but Isabel was right. If he wanted to build something here, he had to stop running and start engaging. For now, though, the spectre of his father loomed large. Cameron Delacroix wouldn't stop, and Matteo knew the next move would be his father's. Whatever came next, Matteo had to be ready. Helena stared at the letter on the counter, the elegant script taunting her with promises she wasn't sure she wanted. The envelope was thick, stamped with the seal of her late father's estate. For weeks, she'd avoided dealing with it, shoving it into a drawer and pretending it didn't exist. But today, Peter Lamont, a board member from her father's company, had sent an email pushing her to attend a meeting about the inheritance. Now, there was no more running. Across the cafe, Noah was restocking shelves, completely unaware of the turmoil brewing in his sister's mind. Helena tapped her fingers against the envelope, debating whether to open it or toss it aside once again. The decision felt too heavy, the weight of her father's legacy pressing down on her like a storm cloud. Helena? Matteo's voice brought her out of her thoughts. She looked up to see him standing nearby, concern etched into his face. You okay? She forced a smile, tucking the letter under the counter. Yeah, just a little distracted. Matteo didn't look convinced, but he didn't press. Instead, he gestured toward the cafe's door. Isabel's outside. She wanted to talk to you about the fundraiser idea. Helena nodded, grateful for the distraction. Thanks. I'll be right there. Once Matteo left, she exhaled slowly, her eyes drifting back to the letter. The idea of stepping into her father's world again, of facing the people who had benefited from his ruthless ambition, made her stomach turn. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered, "This could be your chance to make things right." Outside, Isabel was leaning against the building, her ever-present tote bag slung over her shoulder. She greeted Helena with a warm smile, but it faded as she took in Helena's tense expression. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Helena admitted, crossing her arms. "I got another letter about my dad's estate. They want me to come in for a meeting." Isabel's brow furrowed. "And you're thinking about going?" "I don't know." Helena glanced away, her voice dropping. "That world. It destroyed him. I don't want any part of it." "But what if you could use it to build something better?" Isabel countered, her tone gentle but firm. "Your father's mistakes don't have to define you. And let's be honest, Helena, you've been working yourself to the bone trying to keep this place running. Maybe this is your chance to do more." Helena hesitated, Isabel's words hitting closer to home than she wanted to admit. The cafe had always been her sanctuary, but it was also a constant struggle. The idea of having resources, real resources, to create something meaningful was tempting, even if it meant stepping into her father's shadow. "I just don't want to become him," Helena said quietly. "You won't," Isabel said with certainty. "You're not your father, Helena. You've got a good heart. And if you decide to go, you'll have people who've got your back." Helena managed a small smile, the knot in her chest loosening slightly. "Thanks, Isabel." "Any time," Isabel said with a wink. "Now, let's get back inside before Noah burns the place down." The rest of the day passed in a haze as Helena tried to focus on the usual tasks of running the cafe, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the letter. By the time she closed up for the night, the envelope felt heavier in her pocket, as though it were carrying the full weight of her father's mistakes. She sat alone at one of the tables, the cafe dimly lit with only a few lamps casting warm golden light across the room. Noah had gone to bed early, leaving her with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and her own swirling thoughts. Finally, with a deep breath, Helena pulled the letter from her pocket and opened it. The contents were exactly what she'd expected: an invitation to a formal meeting with her father's company board members. The language was polished and professional, but the underlying message was clear. Her presence was requested to discuss her inheritance and the responsibilities that came with it. Helena's stomach churned. The idea of stepping into that world made her feel small, like a child lost in the shadows of towering skyscrapers and corporate greed. The sound of footsteps broke her concentration. She looked up to see Matteo standing in the doorway, his expression hesitant. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, gesturing toward the open letter. "But it looked like you could use some company." Helena offered a weak smile, folding the letter and placing it back on the table. "It's nothing, just family stuff." Matteo walked over, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. "Family stuff has a way of not being nothing," he said gently. Helena hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the letter. She wasn't used to opening up, especially about something so deeply tied to her family's pain. But there was something about Matteo's quiet presence that made her feel safe. "My dad's company," she began slowly. "They want me to step in and take over, I guess, or at least deal with whatever mess he left behind." Matteo nodded, his gaze steady. "And you don't want to?" "Not really," Helena admitted. "He wasn't a good man, Matteo. He built that company by stepping on people, using them, discarding them when they weren't useful anymore. I don't want to be a part of that." "But what if you could change it?" Matteo asked, leaning forward slightly. "What if you could take what he left behind and use it for something good?" Helena blinked, surprised by the suggestion. "You sound like Isabel." "She's smart," Matteo said with a small smile. "And she's right. You have an opportunity here, Helena. It doesn't have to be about his mistakes. It can be about what you build out of it." The words hung in the air, their weight settling into Helena's mind. For the first time, she considered the possibility that her inheritance didn't have to be a burden. It could be a tool, a way to make a real difference. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," she said softly. "No one ever is," Matteo replied. "But you don't have to do it alone. You have Noah, Isabel, and maybe even me." Helena looked at him, her heart catching in her chest. There was something genuine in his expression, a sincerity she wasn't used to seeing. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't carrying the weight alone. "Thanks," she said quietly. "I'll think about it." Matteo nodded, his presence steady and reassuring. As he stood to leave, Helena glanced back at the letter on the table. The meeting was in 3 days. For the first time, she felt a spark of determination, a whisper of purpose. Maybe Isabel and Matteo were right. This was her chance to redefine what her father's legacy could mean. The boardroom was nothing like Helena had expected. Despite the grandeur of the skyscraper housing her father's company, the space felt cold and uninviting. The walls were stark, adorned with abstract art that did little to brighten the sterile atmosphere. At the center of the room was a massive table, polished to a mirror shine, surrounded by an intimidating array of well-dressed board members. Helena shifted uncomfortably in her seat, clutching the portfolio she'd brought with her. It was mostly empty, a prop to give her hands something to do as her nerves threatened to overwhelm her. The meeting hadn't even started, and already she felt out of place, as though she were a child pretending to be an adult in a world she didn't belong to. Peter Lamont, seated at the head of the table, was the first to speak. His voice carried the polished confidence of someone accustomed to power. "Helena," he began, his tone polite but clipped. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with us today. We know this isn't an easy time for you." She nodded, her throat dry. "I appreciate the opportunity to understand what's happening with the company." Peter smiled thinly, gesturing to a folder in front of him. "Your father's passing left a significant void, both personally and professionally. As his only heir, you're uniquely positioned to step in and guide the future of the company." Helena bristled at the word heir. It felt wrong, like a label she hadn't earned and didn't want. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for that," she said carefully. "I've never been involved in the business before." "That's precisely why we're here," Peter replied smoothly. "The board is more than capable of handling day-to-day operations. What we need is a figurehead, someone to represent stability and continuity. Your presence alone would reassure investors and stakeholders." Helena frowned. The way Peter spoke, it was clear he didn't see her as an active participant, just a convenient face to keep the company afloat. The thought left a bitter taste in her mouth. "I understand the importance of stability," Helena said, her voice firmer now. "But if I'm going to be involved, it won't be as a figurehead. I want to make sure this company operates in a way that reflects my values." Peter's smile faltered slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "Of course," he said, his tone measured, "but these things take time. Perhaps we should focus on establishing your role first and worry about broader changes later." Helena's grip tightened on the portfolio in her lap. She could feel the subtle pressure in Peter's words, the unspoken expectation that she would step aside and let him and the board maintain control. For a moment, she considered walking out, letting them carry on without her. But then she thought of Matteo's words. "You have an opportunity here. It doesn't have to be about his mistakes." Taking a deep breath, Helena straightened in her chair. "I appreciate the board's expertise," she said, meeting Peter's gaze directly. "But if I'm going to be involved, it will be on my terms. That includes reviewing the company's current practices and ensuring they align with what I believe is right." The room went silent. Peter's expression hardened, but he quickly masked it with a neutral smile. "Of course," he said smoothly. "We'll discuss this further as we move forward." As the meeting continued, Helena felt the weight of every glance, every carefully measured response from the board members. She had expected resistance, but the subtle condescension, woven into their polite words, was more exhausting than outright confrontation. They didn't see her as a leader. To them, she was little more than an outsider, a placeholder who didn't belong in their world. Peter eventually shifted the discussion to financials, presenting a detailed report on the company's recent performance. Helena tried to follow along, but the terminology was foreign, and she struggled to grasp the implications of the charts and figures flashing on the screen. It was a stark reminder of how far removed she was from this world. Still, she refused to let her discomfort show. Instead, she jotted down notes, asking pointed questions where she could. The effort didn't go unnoticed. A few board members exchanged glances, their expressions tinged with surprise. Perhaps they hadn't expected her to engage at all. As the meeting neared its end, Peter leaned back in his chair, his smile reappearing. "Well, I think we've covered the key points for today. Helena, we'll follow up with a more detailed plan for your involvement. In the meantime, if there's anything you need, don't hesitate to reach out." Helena nodded, her expression calm despite the storm brewing inside her. "Thank you, Mr. Lamont. I'll take a look at the materials and let you know my thoughts." Peter's smile tightened slightly, but he recovered quickly, standing to signal the meeting's conclusion. The other board members began gathering their belongings, their chatter filling the room as they prepared to leave. Helena remained seated, letting the hum of conversation wash over her as she processed the whirlwind of the past hour. As the room cleared, Peter approached her, his tone more casual, but no less calculated. "Helena, a word?" She stood, clutching her portfolio as he gestured for her to follow him to a corner of the room. His voice dropped to a lower, almost conspiratorial tone. "I admire your determination," he began, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "But I want to caution you. This company is a complex machine. Change, especially the kind you're talking about, takes time. It's easy to get overwhelmed." Helena met his gaze, her resolve hardening. "I understand that. But if I'm going to be involved, I won't settle for being a passive participant. My father's mistakes don't define me, and they won't define this company either." Peter's expression flickered, but he quickly regained his composure. "Of course. Just remember, we're all here to help you succeed." Helena offered a polite smile, though her distrust of him was growing. "Thank you, Mr. Lamont. I appreciate your support." With that, she excused herself, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she left the room. Once she was alone in the elevator, she allowed herself to exhale, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. The meeting had been draining, but it had also been a turning point. For the first time, she felt a flicker of confidence that she could navigate this world on her terms. Later that evening, back at the cafe, Helena sat at her usual spot by the counter, the day's events replaying in her mind. Matteo approached cautiously, sliding into the seat across from her. "How did it go?" he asked. Helena hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "It was a lot," she admitted. "They don't think I belong there. And honestly, I'm not sure they're wrong." Matteo leaned forward, his gaze steady. "But you didn't walk away." "No," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't." "That's what matters," Matteo said softly. "You're doing something most people wouldn't even try. That takes courage." Helena looked at him, the warmth in his words easing the doubt that had lingered since the meeting. "Thanks," she said quietly. "I think I'm going to need all the courage I can get." Matteo smiled, his presence grounding her in a way that few others could. For the first time that day, Helena felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they could face whatever came next. Helena was busy restocking the cafe's shelves when the sound of the doorbell jingling caught her attention. She looked up to see a woman in an elegant cream-colored coat standing in the doorway, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. The woman's poised demeanor and piercing gaze immediately set her apart from the usual customers. For a moment, Helena froze, her instincts kicking in before recognition fully settled. "Vivienne?" Matteo's voice broke the silence as he appeared from the back of the cafe. His tone was calm, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. Helena blinked, piecing together the connection. Vivienne, Matteo's mother. The realization sent a wave of surprise through her, though she quickly masked it, stepping aside to give them space. Vivienne's eyes softened when they landed on Matteo, though her posture remained firm. "Matteo," she said, her voice measured but tinged with emotion. "I've been looking for you." Matteo's shoulders stiffened, and he crossed his arms defensively. "I figured as much." Helena busied herself wiping down the counter, trying to appear occupied while keeping her ears open. The tension between Matteo and his mother was palpable, their conversation unfolding in clipped tones. "You can't keep running like this," Vivian said, her voice low but steady. "Your father—" "Don't," Matteo interrupted, his tone sharp. "This isn't about him." Vivian sighed, her composure wavering for the first time. "I'm not here to defend him. I came because I'm worried about you. Matteo, this isn't sustainable. You've cut yourself off completely. How long do you think you can keep this up?" "I don't need your help," Matteo replied, his voice cold. "I've made my decision." Helena's hands stilled on the counter, her curiosity piqued despite herself. Matteo had always been guarded about his past, but this conversation hinted at depths she hadn't fully grasped. She glanced toward them, catching the flicker of pain in Vivienne's eyes. "You're my son," Vivienne said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I can't just stand by and watch you throw everything away." Matteo's expression hardened, and he took a step back, putting distance between them. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm building a life on my own terms." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Vivian looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand. Finally she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hope you find what you're looking for." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the floor. Matteo watched her leave, his expression unreadable. Helena hesitated before speaking, her voice tentative. "That was your mother?" Matteo glanced at her, the walls he usually kept so carefully intact beginning to crumble. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That was her." Helena watched as Matteo sank into the nearest chair, his usual composure visibly shaken. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze fixed on the floor. For a moment, she considered giving him space, but something told her this wasn't the time to step back. "She seems worried about you," Helena said carefully, choosing her words with precision. Matteo let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Worried? Maybe. But it's not that simple." He leaned back in the chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "Vivian's always been the mediator, the one trying to keep the peace. But she's also been complicit in everything my father's done." Helena hesitated, pulling a chair closer to sit across from him. "What's everything?" "Matteo, I feel like I don't really know you. And after today, I'm starting to realize there's a lot you haven't said." Matteo's jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the armrests of the chair. He seemed to wrestle with an invisible weight, the decision of how much to reveal tearing at him. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low but steady. "My father controls everything. Every aspect of my life has been dictated by his expectations. Where I went to school, the people I associated with, even who I was supposed to marry." Helena's eyes widened slightly, but she stayed silent, letting him continue. "I couldn't take it any more," Matteo admitted, his tone laced with frustration. "So I walked away. I left behind the money, the legacy, all of it. But he doesn't let go that easily. Freezing my accounts, sending Vivian after me, it's just another way to pull me back." Helena leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees. "And what about your mother? Do you think she really wants to pull you back? Or is she just trying to help?" Matteo hesitated, his expression softening slightly. "Vivienne, she's complicated. I think she means well, but she's been under my father's thumb for so long that she doesn't know how to separate herself from him. She wants to help, but only in the way she's been taught, by fixing things on his terms." Helena nodded slowly, piecing together the fragments of Matteo's story. It explained so much: the guarded way he carried himself, the reluctance to talk about his past, and the tension that seemed to follow him like a shadow. "Do you regret it?" she asked gently. "Leaving, I mean." Matteo's gaze met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of vulnerability. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remind myself that staying would have been worse. At least here I have a chance to figure out who I am, not who he wants me to be." Helena smiled faintly, her voice warm. "Well, for what it's worth, I think you're on the right track." The corners of Matteo's mouth lifted in a small, grateful smile, the tension in his posture easing just slightly. "Thanks, Helena." For a moment, the cafe was quiet, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. But it wasn't the oppressive silence of before. It was lighter, tinged with a sense of understanding. Helena didn't know everything about Matteo's past, but she knew enough to see the person he was trying to become. As she stood to clear the table, Matteo's voice stopped her. "Helena, you've been through your own struggles. Why didn't you walk away from this place?" She paused, the question catching her off guard. Turning back to him, she shrugged, her smile bittersweet. "Because it's home, and no matter how hard things get, there's something worth fighting for here." Matteo nodded, her words resonating deeply. For the first time since arriving in New Orleans, he began to wonder if he could build something that felt like home too. Helena adjusted the strap of her bag as she stood outside the towering office building, its sleek, reflective facade stark against the lively charm of New Orleans. Her nerves buzzed beneath her calm exterior. This was it, the moment she would confront the board once again, not as a hesitant participant, but as someone ready to take a stand. She had spent the last few days poring over financial reports, legacy documents, and the company's most recent initiatives. Her nights were long, filled with doubts and second-guessing, but Matteo's quiet encouragement and Isabel's unwavering support had helped her stay grounded. She had a plan now, one that went beyond merely appeasing the board. She was determined to reshape her father's legacy into something meaningful. Pushing open the heavy glass doors, Helena stepped into the cool, hushed lobby. A receptionist greeted her and directed her to the elevator. The ride up was brief, but felt interminable, the soft hum of the machinery amplifying her thudding heartbeat. When the doors slid open, she was met with the same sterile boardroom she had faced before. Only now the tension felt thicker, more anticipatory. Peter Lamont was already seated at the head of the table, his sharp eyes scanning the room as the other board members filed in. He offered Helena a polite nod as she entered, though his expression remained unreadable. "Helena," Peter began once everyone was settled. "Thank you for joining us again. We've reviewed your initial questions and comments, and I must say, your engagement has been refreshing." Helena didn't miss the faint condescension in his tone. She forced a smile, keeping her voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Lamont. I've come prepared with a few proposals I believe could benefit the company and its reputation." Peter raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued but cautious. "By all means, please share." Helena took a deep breath, standing as she placed a folder on the table. "First, I propose allocating a portion of the company's unused assets to fund community development programs here in New Orleans. Specifically, I'd like to establish an art and education center for underprivileged youth, something that aligns with the city's culture and history." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the board members exchanged skeptical glances, while others seemed curious. Peter leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "An admirable idea, but what would this do for the company's bottom line? We can't prioritize charity over profit, Helena. Our investors expect results." Helena met his gaze, her confidence growing. "It's not just charity. It's an investment in the company's public image. After years of negative press, this initiative would show stakeholders that we're committed to making a positive impact. It's a long-term strategy that could rebuild trust and attract new partnerships. The murmurs grew louder, some board members nodding in agreement. Peter's expression remained carefully neutral, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his frustration. "Interesting," he said finally, "but we'll need concrete numbers before moving forward. Sentiment alone isn't enough to justify such a shift." "Of course," Helena replied smoothly. "I've already begun drafting a detailed budget and impact assessment. I'll have it ready for the next meeting." Peter nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Very well. Let's table this discussion for now and move on to—" "Actually," Helena interrupted, her voice steady but firm, "there's one more issue I'd like to address." Helena's interruption caused a noticeable shift in the room. Several board members exchanged glances, while Peter's sharp gaze settled on her. She felt the weight of their attention but didn't flinch. This was her moment to push further, to ensure her voice was heard. "The company's current operations include several partnerships that raise ethical concerns," Helena continued, her tone unwavering. "These contracts may be lucrative, but they're tied to industries and practices that could damage our reputation even further if exposed. I propose we begin an internal review to ensure compliance with ethical standards and re-evaluate partnerships that don't align with those values." The room fell silent. Some board members avoided her gaze, while others looked visibly uncomfortable. Peter leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "That's a bold suggestion," he said finally, his voice measured. "But let's not forget that these partnerships are a significant source of revenue. Cutting ties could have serious consequences for the company's financial stability." Helena nodded, anticipating his argument. "I understand the risks, but the long-term cost of maintaining these partnerships could be far greater. Negative press and public backlash are not things we can afford right now. We need to show that this company is committed to doing better, not just for profit, but for the communities we impact." One of the older board members, a woman with silver hair and sharp features, cleared her throat. "Ms. Beaumont raises a valid point," she said, her voice steady. "The market is changing. Consumers and investors are paying more attention to corporate responsibility. An internal review could be a prudent step, even if it's just to protect ourselves from future scrutiny." Peter's jaw tightened, though he managed to keep his expression neutral. An internal review is a significant undertaking. It would require time, resources, and discretion. We can't afford to create instability within the company. "With respect," Helena replied, "the instability is already there. Ignoring these issues won't make them go away. It will only make them harder to manage when they inevitably come to light. We have an opportunity to get ahead of this, to control the narrative before it controls us." Another board member, a man in his 40s with a thoughtful demeanor, nodded. "She's right. It's better to act now than wait for a crisis to force our hand." Peter's gaze flicked around the room, taking stock of the shifting opinions. The control he had wielded so effortlessly at the start of the meeting seemed to be slipping. Finally, he turned back to Helena, his tone clipped but cordial. "We'll discuss the feasibility of your proposals in more detail at the next meeting. For now, let's move forward with the agenda." Helena nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and adrenaline. She had taken a risk, and while she hadn't achieved immediate victory, she had planted the seeds for change. The board's divided reactions were a clear indication that her voice was beginning to carry weight. Later that evening, Helena sat at a quiet table in the cafe, recounting the day's events to Matteo and Isabel. Noah, perched nearby, pretended not to listen, but occasionally glanced in her direction with a mix of curiosity and pride. "I can't believe you stood up to them like that," Isabel said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've got guts, Helena." "It didn't feel like it at the time," Helena admitted, taking a sip of her coffee. "But I couldn't just sit there and let them keep doing things the same way. If I'm going to be part of this, it has to mean something." Matteo smiled, his expression warm and steady. "You're doing what your father never did, listening, questioning, and standing for something bigger than yourself. That's how you change things." Helena felt a flicker of hope at his words, though the weight of the battle ahead still lingered. "It's a start," she said softly. "But there's a long way to go." Isabel leaned back in her chair, a knowing smile on her lips. "One step at a time, darling. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither is a legacy worth keeping." As the conversation shifted to lighter topics, Helena allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The day's challenges had tested her resolve, but they had also shown her what was possible. For the first time, she felt not just the burden of her father's legacy, but the power to shape it into something new. Matteo paced the small apartment he had rented above a bookstore in the French Quarter, the phone clutched tightly in his hand. His father's voice still echoed in his ears from the earlier call, a volatile mix of threats and veiled attempts at manipulation. Cameron's patience had run out, and Matteo knew this was the moment he'd been dreading. "You're throwing away everything," Cameron had snarled. "Do you even understand what you're doing? Do you know what you're costing this family?" Matteo had responded calmly, though every word felt like walking a tightrope. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm choosing my life, not the one you've planned for me." Cameron's response was icy, cutting through the line like a blade. "You think you're free, Matteo? That you can just walk away? Let me remind you, Delacroix isn't just a name, it's an empire, and I won't let you destroy it." Now, standing alone in the dimly lit room, Matteo stared out the window at the bustling streets below. The weight of his father's words settled heavily on his chest. For so long, Cameron had dictated every aspect of his life, wielding power like a weapon. But here, in New Orleans, Matteo had tasted freedom, real freedom. The thought of going back felt suffocating. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a message from Isabel. "Jazz night at the cafe. You better show up." Matteo sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't feel like socializing, but the thought of sitting alone with his thoughts for the rest of the evening was even less appealing. Grabbing his jacket, he left the apartment and made his way down to Helena's cafe. The cafe was alive with energy when Matteo arrived, the usual quiet atmosphere replaced by the lively sounds of a jazz trio performing in the corner. Isabel was at the center of it all, her laughter ringing out as she chatted with a group of regulars. Helena moved gracefully between tables, balancing trays and exchanging warm smiles with the crowd. As Matteo entered, Helena spotted him and waved him over to an empty seat near the counter. "You made it," she said, her smile softening the tension he'd carried with him. "I wasn't sure I'd be good company tonight," Matteo admitted, sinking into the seat. "But this place has a way of pulling you in," Helena chuckled, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "That's the idea. No matter what's going on outside, we try to make this a little escape." Matteo nodded, the warmth of the cafe beginning to ease his nerves. For a while he sat in comfortable silence, watching the musicians and the way the crowd swayed to the rhythm. But as the evening wore on, the tension from his earlier conversation with Cameron began to creep back in. Helena noticed the shift in his demeanor, her brow furrowing slightly. "Everything okay?" Matteo hesitated, the words forming on his lips before he could stop them. "My father called. It wasn't good." Helena placed a hand gently on the counter, her expression softening with concern. "Do you want to talk about it?" Matteo stared at the coffee cup in front of him, his fingers tracing the rim. For a moment he considered brushing it off, offering some vague reassurance that everything was fine. But he was tired of pretending, especially with her. Taking a deep breath, he began. "My father isn't the kind of man who lets things go," Matteo said quietly. "He spent his entire life building an empire, and to him, I'm just another part of that. Walking away wasn't just about leaving my old life behind. It was about defying everything he stands for, and now he's making it clear there's a price for that." Helena leaned in, her voice steady but gentle. "What kind of price?" "He froze my accounts," Matteo admitted, his tone bitter. "That was his first move, and now he's threatening to come after anyone connected to me. He thinks he can scare me into coming back, but I can't. I won't." Helena's eyes widened slightly, the gravity of his words sinking in. "You're saying he might try to hurt people? Here?" Matteo shook his head, though he couldn't hide the uncertainty in his expression. "Not physically. That's not his style. But he has power, connections. He'll use influence, money, whatever he can to make life difficult for anyone who gets in his way." The weight of his confession hung in the air, the lively chatter of the cafe fading into the background. Helena looked at Matteo, her gaze unwavering. "So, what are you going to do?" "I don't know," Matteo admitted, his voice low. "For so long I've been running, trying to escape him, trying to build something for myself. But maybe running isn't enough anymore. Maybe it's time to face him head on." Helena's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered his words. "If you're going to fight back, you don't have to do it alone," she said finally. "You've got people here who care about you, Matteo. Isabel, Noah, me. We'll stand with you." Matteo looked up, meeting her gaze. There was no hesitation in her eyes, only a quiet strength that gave him the smallest glimmer of hope. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. "That means more than you know." Before Helena could respond, Isabel appeared at their table, her timing as impeccable as always. "What's with the long faces?" she asked, plopping down next to Matteo with a glass of wine in hand. "This is supposed to be a jazz night, not a therapy session." Matteo chuckled despite himself, shaking his head. "Just life catching up with me." "Well, whatever it is, don't let it ruin the vibe," Isabel said, waving a hand dismissively. "You're in New Orleans now. When life throws you punches, you dance around them." Helena smiled, the tension in the air easing slightly. She's not wrong. As the music picked up again, Matteo let himself relax, if only for a moment. The road ahead felt daunting, but for the first time he realized he didn't have to face it alone. The people around him, the makeshift family he'd found in New Orleans, were his strength. And with them by his side, he began to believe that he could stand up to his father and finally claim the life he'd been fighting for. Matteo knocked lightly on the cafe's side door, the one Helena had shown him months ago as a shortcut to the back kitchen. It was late, long past closing, but the lights inside were still on. After a few moments the door opened, and Helena appeared, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Matteo," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "What's going on? It's late." "I needed to talk," he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "About everything." Helena gestured toward one of the small tables in the corner of the kitchen. The cafe was quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound. Matteo sat down, running a hand through his hair as Helena took the seat across from him. "I haven't been honest with you," Matteo began, his voice low. "Not completely, and if we're going to keep moving forward, you deserve to know the truth." Helena folded her hands on the table, her eyes steady as they met his. "Okay," she said simply, her tone neither pressing nor dismissive. "I'm listening." Matteo exhaled, the weight of his confession looming over him. My full name, is Matteo Delacroix. My father is Cameron Delacroix, the head of one of the largest tech conglomerates in the country. I walked away from all of it, my family, the money, everything, because I couldn't live under his control anymore. Helena's expression didn't change immediately, though her brow furrowed slightly. Delacroix, she repeated, the name clearly striking a chord. I've heard of them. I'm not surprised, Matteo said with a wry smile. My father's made sure that name is everywhere. But the truth is, the legacy behind it isn't something I'm proud of. It's built on manipulation, greed, and stepping on anyone who gets in the way. I didn't want to be part of that anymore. Helena leaned back in her chair, processing his words. That's why you came here, she said slowly. To get away. Matteo nodded. At first, I just wanted to disappear, to figure out who I was without him pulling the strings. But then I met you, and Noah, and Isabel. For the first time, I felt like I had a chance to build something real. Helena's gaze softened, though there was still a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Why are you telling me this now? Because my father isn't going to stop, Matteo said, his voice firm. He's already trying to pull me back, and I know it's only a matter of time before he starts interfering with the people I care about. I didn't want to drag you into this without being honest about who I am. Helena was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. Finally, she looked up, her voice steady. You're right, I deserve to know. But Matteo, you're not just your father's son. Whatever his legacy is, it doesn't define you. Matteo felt a wave of relief wash over him at Helena's words. But it was fleeting. He knew this was only the beginning of the conversation. Thank you for saying that, he said softly. But it's not just about me anymore. My father will use anyone and anything to get what he wants. That means you, the cafe, Isabel, Noah. You could all be targets if he thinks it will bring me back. Helena's eyes narrowed, her protective instincts flaring at the mention of Noah. What do you mean, targets? Are you saying he would go after my family or the cafe? He wouldn't do anything obvious, Matteo said quickly, wanting to calm her but also knowing he couldn't sugarcoat the truth. But he's influential. He could pressure suppliers, spread rumors, make it harder for you to keep this place running. It's the kind of control he thrives on, subtle but effective. Helena straightened in her seat, her jaw tightening. Then we won't let him. This cafe has survived worse, and so have I. If he tries to push us, we'll push back. Matteo blinked, her defiance catching him off guard. Helena, you don't understand how powerful he is. Maybe not, she said firmly. But I understand what it's like to fight for something you believe in. This cafe isn't just a business. It's my home, Noah's home, and I won't let anyone take that away from us. Her words struck a chord in Matteo, a reminder of why he had been drawn to her in the first place. Helena wasn't just strong, she was unyielding in her convictions, a trait he admired deeply, but he also knew the reality of his father's power, and he couldn't let her shoulder the burden alone. Then we'll fight him together, Matteo said, his voice resolute. I won't let him destroy what you've built here. But to do that, I need to stop running. I need to face him, once and for all. Helena's expression softened, a flicker of concern crossing her face. What does that mean, Matteo? Are you thinking of going back? Not exactly, he replied, his tone thoughtful. But I need to confront him. Make it clear that I'm not coming back, no matter what he does. And I need to make sure he understands that if he crosses the line, there will be consequences. Helena reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his. You're not in this alone, she said quietly. Whatever you decide, we're with you. Matteo looked at her, the sincerity in her voice grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. That means everything to me. The quiet moment between them was interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching the kitchen. Isabel appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes immediately picking up on the tension in the room. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked, her tone teasing but curious. Helena pulled her hand back, shaking her head. "No, we were just talking." "Talking, huh?" Isabel said, her gaze darting between them. "Well, whatever it is, you'd better figure it out quickly. The world doesn't wait, darling." As she disappeared back into the cafe, Matteo and Helena exchanged a look. Isabel's words, as usual, carried a truth neither could deny. Time was running out, and the choices they made in the coming days would shape everything. The conference room buzzed with muted conversation as board members shuffled into their seats. Matteo stood in the hallway just outside, his reflection staring back at him from the glass walls. The polished veneer of the corporate world still felt foreign, but today he wasn't here to fit in, he was here to confront it. Taking a deep breath, he adjusted his tie, a detail he'd reluctantly agreed to as a concession to formality. Beside him, Helena placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "You've got this," she said softly. Her presence was a steadying force, grounding him in a way that nothing else could. "Let's hope so," Matteo replied, his voice quiet but resolute, "because there's no going back after this." Together they stepped into the room, the murmurs dying down as heads turned. Matteo scanned the faces of the board members, his father's cold gaze meeting his from the far end of the table. Cameron Delacroix sat like a monarch on a throne, exuding the same commanding presence that had once kept Matteo tethered to his expectations. "Matteo," Cameron said smoothly, his tone deceptively cordial, "I wasn't expecting you to bring company." "This isn't just about me anymore," Matteo replied evenly. "And I thought it was time the board heard a different perspective." Cameron's expression remained impassive, though a flicker of annoyance flashed in his eyes. "Very well, let's begin." As the meeting commenced, it became clear that Cameron had prepared his usual arsenal of tactics: financial projections, power plays, and thinly veiled threats disguised as strategic insights. Matteo listened carefully, his resolve solidifying with each calculated word. When Cameron began outlining plans to expand partnerships that Matteo knew to be ethically questionable, he decided it was time to speak. "Before we move forward," Matteo interrupted, his voice steady, "I think we need to address something important." The room fell silent, all eyes shifting to him. Cameron's expression tightened, but he gestured for Matteo to continue. "The partnerships you're proposing," Matteo said, his gaze sweeping across the room, "might look good on paper, but they're damaging our reputation and the communities we claim to serve. If this company wants to remain relevant in the future, we need to start making decisions that reflect our values, not just our bottom line." A murmur rippled through the room. Some board members exchanged uncertain glances, while others nodded in quiet agreement. Cameron leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he regarded Matteo. "And what exactly do you propose, Matteo?" he asked, his tone laced with challenge. Matteo glanced at Helena, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Turning back to the table, he said, "I propose we redirect our focus towards sustainable, community-driven initiatives. We can't build a future by exploiting the present. It's time for this company to take responsibility and lead by example." The silence that followed Matteo's words was heavy, but he didn't falter. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the board members' mixed reactions. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others regarded him with curiosity or cautious approval. It was clear his proposal had disrupted the carefully orchestrated dynamic that Cameron had cultivated. Cameron, however, remained unfazed. He leaned forward, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "And how exactly do you intend to fund these community-driven initiatives?" he asked, his tone sharp but controlled. "You speak of values, but values don't keep the lights on or satisfy investors." Matteo met his father's gaze, refusing to back down. "By reassessing the company's current projects and eliminating partnerships that damage our reputation. We've already seen how those deals are a liability, not just ethically, but financially. Public trust is at an all-time low, and that directly affects long-term profitability." One of the older board members, the same woman who had spoken up in Helena's previous meeting, cleared her throat. "Matteo raises a valid point," she said. "Consumer behavior is changing. Investors and clients alike are starting to prioritize companies that demonstrate genuine responsibility. This could be an opportunity to set ourselves apart." Cameron's expression hardened slightly, though he masked it well. "While that may be true in theory, the execution of such a shift would be costly. We can't afford to act impulsively." "It's not impulsive," Matteo countered. "It's proactive. If we don't adapt now, we'll be forced to when the damage is already done. The time to act is before the headlines, not after." Helena watched the exchange unfold, her heart pounding as she saw Matteo stand his ground. His passion and conviction were undeniable, and she could see it resonating with at least some of the board members. She decided to step in, knowing her voice could lend weight to his argument. "I've seen firsthand how a commitment to community can transform a business," Helena said, her voice steady but firm. "This cafe might not be a corporation, but it's a testament to how prioritizing people builds trust and loyalty. Imagine what a company like this could accomplish if it embraced that philosophy on a larger scale." The room seemed to shift, a ripple of intrigue spreading as Helena spoke. Matteo glanced at her, gratitude flickering in his eyes before he turned back to the board. "We're not suggesting abandoning profit," Matteo continued. "We're suggesting a sustainable approach, one that prioritizes both financial success and social responsibility. This isn't just about doing what's right, it's about securing the future." The younger man at the far end of the table, who had remained quiet until now, nodded thoughtfully. "It's a bold strategy," he said, "but it's not without merit. The market is shifting. Maybe it's time we do too." For the first time, Cameron looked genuinely unsettled. His control over the room was slipping, and he knew it. "This isn't a decision to be made lightly," he said, his voice colder now. "We'll need to review the numbers and weigh the risks." "Of course," Matteo said evenly. "But this conversation is long overdue. It's time we stop focusing on what's easy and start focusing on what's necessary." As the meeting adjourned, the tension in the room was palpable. Cameron avoided Matteo's gaze as he left, his carefully maintained facade showing signs of a crack. Matteo exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he turned to Helena. "You were incredible," he said quietly. "I don't think I could have done that without you." Helena smiled, her eyes warm. "You didn't need me. That fire was all yours. I just added a little fuel." Matteo chuckled, the weight of the day beginning to lift. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that his fight against Cameron wasn't futile. That change, however small, was possible. The sun was beginning to set over New Orleans, casting a warm, golden glow over the city as Helena stood on the porch of the cafe. She watched as Matteo walked toward her, his expression calm but resolute. There was a peace in his eyes that she hadn't seen before, as if the weight he had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. "Long day?" Helena asked, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You could say that," Matteo replied, joining her on the steps. "But a good one. The board is starting to come around. It's not going to be easy, but for the first time, it feels like they're listening." Helena nodded, her gaze drifting to the street where the last few customers were strolling away. "And your father?" Matteo sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He didn't say much after the meeting, but I could see it in his eyes. He knows things are changing. He might fight it, but the tide's turning, and even he can't stop that. Helena reached out, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You stood your ground, Matteo. That's more than most people could do." He turned to her, his expression softening. "I couldn't have done it without you. You gave me a reason to fight. Not just against him, but for something better." Helena smiled, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I think you've always had that in you. You just needed someone to remind you." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the city's rhythm humming softly around them. Matteo reached into his pocket, his movements almost hesitant, and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple but elegant ring. Helena's breath caught as she looked at the ring, the soft glow of the setting sun catching on the delicate band. Matteo held it out, his hand steady, but his eyes filled with vulnerability. "I've been running for so long," Matteo said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "But being here with you, with everyone at the cafe, has shown me what it feels like to truly belong. You've given me more than I could ever ask for, Helena. Hope, a home, and a reason to believe in myself again. I don't want to keep running. I want to build something real, something lasting, with you." Helena's lips parted, her heart pounding in her chest. Matteo's words, raw and sincere, filled her with a warmth that seemed to chase away every shadow of doubt. "Matteo," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "you've already changed my life. This place, this city, it's brighter because of you, and I can't imagine any of it without you." A smile spread across Matteo's face, his confidence growing as he held her gaze. "Then say yes," he said softly. "Marry me, Helena." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. She nodded, her smile breaking into a laugh as she whispered, "Yes." Matteo slipped the ring onto her finger, and as their hands intertwined, the city around them seemed to come alive with celebration. From the cafe, Isabel's voice rang out as she clapped her hands. "About time," she called, grinning widely as Noah stood beside her, pretending to gag but failing to hide his smirk. The moment was perfect, not just for Matteo and Helena, but for the community that had become their family. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a soft twilight, they sat together, the promise of a new chapter unfolding before them.